supposition, there is a quantifiable amount of usage per person of the slow renewable resources. More broadly still, there is a quantifiable amount of usage available per person of the resources necessary for the transporting of goods and services between non-adjacent bioregions. Such may amount to, for instance, energy use and labor requirements. The costs of that being strongly related to the distance traveled, weakly related to the kind of good or service being transported. Insofar as such is traversed via the internets, we may very well assume the cost is basically negligible and is already ubiquitously distributable. Hence, barriers to such transporting of goods and services are not likely of much concern. Let us reassert that here we are speaking of surplus goods produced within a bioregion after they have provided for the needs, wants and desires of their adjacent bioregions and the needs of non-adjacent bioregions. The trading of surplus goods between non-adjacent bioregions towards the ends of meeting the wants and desires thereof. Suppose each bioregion places their goods on an open gift-giving market, essentially saying, "Hey, I got lots of this shit, anyone want it?" A bioregion accepts the gifts within the constraints of their allotment of energy use and labor. Call such trade tokens. Trade token quotas as if they were the relevant currency. There is much to be said for this as pragmatic. Such a trade token system, after all, is bioregionally restrained in its effective use, globalized, and tied to the relevant metrics of trade, namely the renewal rates of the various resources. However, folks ought expect the same kind of issues to develop through its use as one would expect via any kind of monetary system: wealth accumulation of trade tokens, massive inequalities in the system developing, etc. There are few reasons to think otherwise. What may be worth considering is what a wealth inequality would actualize in that system. For instance, if it were the case that a massive surplus in trade tokens were tied rather directly to existing inequalities, such that places that are in need of development are granted more such trade tokens, perhaps it would be the case that the existing inequalities would thereby be ameliorated. I think, however, that experience ought to have taught us that such amounts to a kind of massive redistribution that is effectively forced, which has its own issues, that folks would thereby be more reluctant to accept such. Moreover, people may be incentivized to cheat, steal, lie, etc., with such a system in order to obtain more trade tokens. It is one thing to note the relevant restraints of resource renewal rates, to work within them, etc. It is another thing to, in effect, monetize those. Regardless of the efficacy of doing so, such monetization effectively ruins the premise of a moneyless free labor society. Hence, it ought be avoided. Although I don't want to explain every aspect of it here, the claim is going to be that at best, most, etc., any such systemization would merely replicate all the problems in the current system without actually handling any of them. At worst, and it may be a very bad worst, doing so may in effect intensify the destruction of resources through their direct monetization, create more obvious and direct causes for resource wars, and further exacerbate the problems of inequalities by tying them more directly to the resources, rather than to the mere symbologies of monies. In other words, imagine people fighting over dirt because dirt is valued and thereby one is wealthy. It is exactly as dumb as it sounds. People lying, cheating, stealing, fighting, killing, and dying over dirt or seashells, or whatever other natural resource so valued via this kind of systemization. Call it trade tokens, call it gold, call it dirt, call it money, it's all the same shit. And it all produces the same kinds of results, lots of bads, and some goods I've been trying to go out of my way to highlight. In either case, in any case, trade tokenization is unlikely to solve the problems, and has some likelihood of exacerbating them. Of labor, it may very well be the case that the labor can simply be supplied via the bioregion requesting the surplus of goods, e.g., you can have this, but you gots to pick it up yourself. Interestingly enough, there are plenty of shipping vessels, trains, and supply networks and plenty of people either with the relevant skills to crew them or the capacity to learn said skills. Hence, it is plausible and likely preferable to consider these kinds of transporting vessels as communal vessels. The scheduling would be tricky, but then, it already is, and such is not really anything like an impossible task. As with most things, the relevant knowledge and skills to do such things is already present within the relevant systems in the current. The notion, roughly, is that such transport fleets can be utilized in a communal fashion wherein the labor to crew them is shared. If you want to use the vessel, then provide the labor. Such needn't necessarily be the case, but in all pragmatics would be the case. For instance, the transport of goods to bioregions that do not have access to a port, either directly or indirectly via their adjacent bioregions, need to have some method of utilizing ships to transport goods and services. Likewise, it is unclear to what degree we would really want mass overland transports, such as trains and trucks. I do want to suggest that overall such infrastructure is largely already in place, and likely has massive surpluses wherever it is in place, in the sense that overall interbioregional trade would be minimized within this system, and hence the utilization of trains or anything for transportation would significantly decrease. The issues of transportation are developed elsewhere in this piece. As the matter relates to the open gift-giving market, the utilization of those transportation systems may occur in something very much like this kind of fashion. Though note that the labor involved in transportation in interbioregional trade could very well be construed as just another job, and hence it doesn't particularly matter who is doing it. The fixation on the particulars of who is doing this or that job may amount to the wrong kind of disposition on the matter. There are somebodies out there willing and able to do the job. We don't really need that many people doing it, and simply providing for their well-being is what they are looking for. The notion of ownership of the means of transport, in other words, is somewhat silly. Insofar as it may not be, something akin to the preceding is the likely outcome. To paraphrase the poets, there's no need to argue anymore as a sumptuous leading to Zion by Lauryn Hill. Of energy, in the current such is a bit more complicated, as we really ought to be staying within the constraints of the rates of renewals, and there are significant concerns about climate change. Until such a time as those are addressed, there is in effect a certain limit within which the species ought to constrain itself, hence the purchasing of such goods via a bioregion's allotment of energy usable for such purposes. This has a worthwhile side effect of incentivizing the creation of more quickly renewable energy sources, and a move away from the consumption of fossil fuels. In the longer term, we ought expect such a system to reach a maximal capacity of interbioregional trade, that is, the equitable distribution of goods throughout the globe. Specifically as the capacity to transport goods and services reaches a peak, while staying within the limits of the relevant renewal rates, tempered by the relative self-sufficiency of each bioregion, and preferences being given towards shorter supply lines overall, The system's broad output will be the equitable distribution of all goods and services. While such doesn't in and of itself entail the equal distribution of all goods and services, it does entail a maximally distributed systemization of trade. In other words, we would expect there to be differentiations in what goods and services each bioregion has. The amount of such goods and services may vary, but overall they are equitably distributed. Noting, of course, that such concerns of equality of distribution are fairly ephemeral. Asymmetrical distributions are a well-understood norm and reality, and that in the current such inequalities of distribution are pretty extreme as it is. Those paying attention to the internet currents will note that this kind of gift-giving of surplus goods and services is already happening on a local individual/familial level. Hence, it isn't as if such doesn't already exist, proving thereby that such is possible. The scale of such practices being proposed here is just different. There may, in other words, be concerns about how scalar differences may affect such gift-giving practices. However, what cannot be said is that such gift-giving practices are invalid out of hand. Of course, this piece is exactly attempting to explain what those differences are, how to manage them, and what the species may expect from such differences in scalar application. Regarding the determination as to which goods ought to be transported, that is, what gifts a bioregion accepts, there are a few reasonable propositions, noting that the issues associated with decision-making are given a fuller treatment in the real concerns of a moneyless society section, especially Section 12D, who makes the decisions. Local democratically elected political leaders. This may be a relevant role for such people. They are generally tasked with the overall well-being of their local communities, and hence can be given the relevant information, utilize the relevant metrics in politics as they are, that is, the reading of the needs, wants and desires of the local population, utilizing the same kinds of techniques they do as it is. However, there are serious concerns regarding any fiat determination, and issues specifically with democratic processes whereby it breeds political infighting. Specifically, differing opinions are given public platforms to expressly fight each other in order to sway other people's opinions. There are few protections offered in such a system for the spreading of lies, misinformation, etc., and depending on the actionable policies a democratic process is allowed to do, such can lead to rather horrific consequences. Just as bad, the incentives associated with garnering votes are not particularly relevant to the questions at hand. Democratic processes seriously risk making decisions predicated upon wrong-headed notions. That is, trading for something that has no particular value to anyone involved, save that it is good politics. Its utility, it's pragmatic, having nothing at all to do with the relevant issues at hand. Likewise as bad, perhaps worse yet, such democratic processes significantly incentivize politicians and people in general to do something, anything at all, in order to garner votes. To look like they are doing something, to have a good record to run on, and so forth. In instances wherein exactly doing very little is what is called for, when good enough solutions are already in play, these incentives become seriously perverse. Among its grossest kinds of examples are the incentivization to go to war, to demonize particular groups, create problems to solve, and in general, to make things seem a lot worse than they really are. I would temper this sum by noting that the properly joint-carved structure may very well significantly ameliorate those kinds of practices. and hence democratic processes may be more stable in this systemization. The minimization of the politico and the various other real benefits of a moneyless free labor society likewise may significantly ameliorate these sorts of issues. See the real benefits sections. I'd also temper that by noting that the other kinds of options available may be less desirable. Direct democratic voting. There isn't any obvious reason why such determinations can't simply be done directly, wherein each of each person makes a determination as to what goods they think they ought to trade for. Such entails generally supplying the relevant labor for the tasks, which entails the work of the hands of labor, but such is determined within the free labor metrics already, as in, there will be some job posting, the positions will be filled via the other relevant metrics. Note this ought not be confused with the individual trade, the personal trade, etc. Here, again, we are speaking of the determination of importing and exporting of goods and services to meet the wants and desires of non-adjacent bioregions, which amounts to fairly en masse kinds of trades that are not individualistic in their formal or informal structure. The potential issues with this are basic stupidity of people tbh, which is a bit harsh but perhaps a reality. To point to some of the rather obvious potential flaws with this, the average person doesn't have the relevant information to make a good determination as to what the local bioregion may actually need, let alone want or desire. Moreover, people in general are not generally interested in taking the time to do that kind of labor, that is, take the time to learn all the relevant information, and it is likely the case that a system that would require them to do so is undesirable too. It may be possible to provide that info in some highly accessible manner. Consider the following. Accepting this gift entails X amount of labor for transport, X amount of our allotment of renewable usages, X amount of labor for local distribution, X amount of labor for local processing. For instance, the crafting of clothing from the whole cloth, creating of various processed foods for consumption, etc. We currently have Y amount of these goods as it is. There is Y amount of unmet demand for these goods as it is. We ought to prioritize this or that good for thus and such reasons. And so on. The breadth of considerations involved, the time required to do so, etc. all suggest that a direct voting systemization is not likely particularly desirable. Hence, the probable role of specialized labor in the form of some kind of democratically elected local official, who makes those kinds of decisions for the local bioregion. Such is familiar enough to people as regards its efficacies and pitfalls, rationales, etc., that I won't bother detailing them here. Specialized labor. It may be held that such is a specialized job with specialized skills associated with it that doesn't necessarily entail any kind of government aspect attached to it. Granting that no such position exists, or rather, that the closest to such a position is in fact government officials, I don't personally see any reason as to why such a position couldn't be held as just another job option available to people. I'd suggest though that at that point we are mostly quibbling over titles, methodology of hiring and firing, and plausibly capacity for people to actively participate in the hiring and firing process. We may assume, in other words, that if it were just another job, that person's hiring and firing would be delegated to their various bosses. Even assuming virtuous intentions on the part of the bosses and virtuous methodologies of decision-making, the local people would have no obvious recourse to the hiring and firing of the bosses. Ultimately, on this particular point, the question of who ought to be responsible for such decisions likely favors the local politician, for exactly that reason. Maker's choice. There is a probable group of people who will hold something like, the people who made the surpluses ought to make the decisions, or that people who run the industries ought to make the decision, etc. This seems fairly well awful, to be perfectly honest about it. For one thing, people doing so don't really have any obvious incentives towards doing good trading for the community as such. In the currents, that is, such trading is largely predicated upon the accumulation of wealth, etc., on a personal level, rather than anything particularly like a concern for the local community as such, let alone concerns for the bioregion and adjacent bioregions. Hence, their existing skill set isn't really even appropriate to the relevant tasks. For another, such incentivizes those industries to overproduce in order to obtain the capacity to make such decisions. For still another, it risks remaking the concept of ownership of those industries, rather than the understanding that those industries are simply run like any other labor and produce goods for people in general. What these kinds of concerns are rightly pointing to, however, are legit fears of government control of the local industries towards the production of goods that labor isn't particularly interested in doing. Concerns, that is, that local politicians may try to game the system in order to effectively force people to labor at something they otherwise wouldn't, at the promise of obtaining goods and services from some non-adjacent bioregion. These are the kinds of legit fears regarding communism, oligarchies, democracies, monarchies, and other sorts of fiat-derived decision-makers. Of course, it's worth recalling that the suggestion is democratic. In other words, if folks don't like the local politician, they do have recourse via running for office themselves, voting them out, etc. We may consider such a technical task, a professional trade, something that is learned like any other trade. Hence, aiming towards meritocracy regarding selecting of goods and services for the betterment of the bioregion. Note that this has significant advantages over democratically elected processes, in that the latter are largely predicated upon rhetorical skills, persuasion, etc., lies for the most part, that is, towards them getting elected. It is a rather brutal process. It may be the case that, absent many of the corrupting influences of politics via the demarcation of bioregions as their domain of interests, limitations of any real power of control, etc., that democratic processes of election may still be valid. Regardless, it is noteworthy that whomever is tasked with this particular aspect is utilizing the same set of concerns, and ultimately just trying to better fulfill the needs, wants and desires of their locale through proper selection of what's offered in the open gift-giving market. Noting here that this is distinct from the prospects of determining what is offered up on the open gift-giving market. In other words, what is offered up on the open gift-giving market is determined via means other than that, whereby what is selected from the open gift-giving market is determined. What is offered up on the open gift-giving market is largely dealt with elsewhere in this piece, here noting that broadly it is the hands of labor approach, the open gift-giving market itself, and the capacity of individuals, small businesses, cottage industries, and international industries that largely determine such things themselves by having access to the proper information via the open gift-giving market. The point here is that in determining what goods to receive from the open gift-giving market doesn't functionally operate well via the individual industries, small businesses, etc., beyond they themselves doing so to merely meet the supplies they need to do their various jobs. Corp X, again, may know what it needs to make the goods or provide the services they're tasked with supplying, but in terms of picking out some other set of miscellaneous surplus goods and services that are available as surplus on the open gift-giving market for a given bioregion, they've neither the skills, the interests, expertise, trust, or anything else to do that kind of task. Such may be understood as the barterer's role, discussed more fully later in this piece. See also all discussions regarding the open gift-giving market, and Section 14M Big Computer Scalarly Relevant Data as probable methodologies for making these kinds of determinations. Examples in the open gift-giving market. Suppose that a bioregion puts on the open gift-giving market their surplus of goods, and nobody wants them. Such is indicative of a surplus in the market for those goods, within the constraints of the renewal rates of resources. In the short term, such may in part be due to endemic poverty within a given bioregion, basically too many unmet needs, wants and desires such that they can't be fulfilled via their quota. That is, they would have wanted those goods or services, but they cannot afford it due to the trade token mechanism. Note, however, that within the Moneyless Free Labor Society the reduction of surplus labor increases the overall availability of the allotments, hence such concerns may be a bit more theoretical than not. Also recall that the surpluses we are speaking of are those available after the needs requirements are met, thus the needs of the endemically impoverished are prioritized before the surplus goes on the gift-giving open market. Moreover, in the mid and long term the bioregions will tend towards greater self-sustainability simply as a matter of the joint carving structure of the system. The adaptation from extraction of resources to far distant lands towards their primary use within the bioregion and its adjacent bioregions already goes a long way towards addressing much of the endemic poverty in many bioregions. That said, this kind of concern rightly points to a problem with dealing with existing inequities and utilizing a trade token quota system. It also raises serious concerns that a trade token quota system is essentially currency by another name. Trade tokens within an open gift-giving market are not soluble. In the short, mid and long term, such as identified in the early stages as surplus goods, rather than waiting to try one's luck in some far distant market, selling the goods, etc. If no one is willing to even take them for free, then there is clearly a surplus of goods and very likely therefore a surplus of labor. In the case of various crops, such indicates fields in a bioregion that ought to not be used, at least at that point. Hence, less labor, fewer goods produced, less overconsumption, etc. In the case of worked goods from cottage industries, such amounts to a rather straightforward reduction in the production of said goods, and hence a reduction in the overall labor. In addition to folks placing their surpluses on the open gift-giving market, bioregions can simply place their needs, wants, and desires on the gift-giving market. This doesn't guarantee that they will be met, of course, but it does provide insight for people in all bioregions as to what some of the unmet needs, wants, and desires are within that bioregion. Hence granting them the possibility of noting that they can meet those needs, wants and desires via their own bioregions. Such may, for instance, entail that some field that was previously left unused is again planted to produce those sorts of goods, or that some other kinds of crops ought to be grown wherein such may not even entail a change in the labor being done. Or some factory that was previously overproducing some good and hence had reduced producing it, once again begins producing more of it. Herein all the guesswork is largely simply removed from the system. In terms of trading, as in the ethicity of doing so, the pragmatics of doing so, efficacy of doing so, and the rationale for doing so at all for anyone anywhere, this modality actually makes a lot of sense. That is, the bare mechanics of trade being put forwards in a forum whereby folks simply place their needs, wants, desires, and surpluses thereof model the functional and practical role of trade. This constitutes the open gift-giving market in its bare-bones structure. See also the other sections dealing with the open gift-giving market. Again noting that such has always been the functional role of trade, money just being a tool the species used to facilitate such practices. Removing the old tool and inserting the new tool of the open gift-giving model is what is being argued for. Why to interbioregional trade at all? Why would any given bioregion bother to do so for some far distant bioregion? That has already been addressed in other places, and largely doesn't bear repeating here. What may be worth noting is that in every meaningful sense this is what the current markets try to do via the metrics of money, economics of supply and demand, etc. All we are holding to here is that the tool of money isn't necessary, and moreover, that the incentives money provides have some rather perverse consequences. Consider the perspective of the cottage industries in particular. The situation regarding multinational industries is different. There is an inherent interconnectedness to them. They themselves are dependent upon trade between far distant bioregions, and everyone can likely agree that at least some of them are good overall for people globally. They may need to be re-geared in how they function, distribute goods and services, etc. But what they produce is essentially goods and services that can only really exist via non-adjacent bioregional trade. Such is not the case regarding the cottage industry. Suppose the cottage industry meets all the needs, wants and desires of their relevant set of bioregions to which they are tasked with meeting such things. Why bother to make more? What incentives do the laborers there have to produce surpluses? Primary motivations to provide for interbioregional trade. There are actually a fair number of valid real-world reasons that don't depend upon any sense of force. In the open gift-giving market, after all, bioregions make requests for such things. Consider such order requests, a request for someone else to provide such things. Such motivations therein may amount to kindness, love, generosity, boredom, etc. There is no real shortage of people who do these kinds of things out of hand. Many of the blockages of doing so in the current are money, as in, rich people have that capacity, poor people have far less capacity to do so. If after all people are laboring less, and perhaps far less, there is no small degree whereby they may be willing to do such things for senses of kindness, generosity, something to do, feeling good for helping others, doing what needs or ought to be done, etc. This kind of motivation is far too oft overlooked. Again, consider how much free labor is already done, beyond helping others. I mean all the free labor spent doing a wide variety of things as it is. People make clothing for fun at this point, all the open-sourced products available online. Retirees make up a bulk of the volunteer operations. Folks that aren't working outside the home oft find a wide variety of other sorts of useful activities to do, and in times of duress folks tend to actually band together to take care of what ought to be taken care of. Moreover, the amount of labor actually required to supply people in need is radically less than it used to be. Overall, the requirements of cottage industries to meet such things diminishes within the system as a whole. If, after all, meeting the needs, wants and desires of some far distant bioregion entails an extra few days of work, in a world wherein the amount of existing labor is significantly reduced, such is not really that big an ask. Secondary motivations to interbioregional trade. Desires to be seen and heard. Such are the artist's kind of concerns, but again, such ought not be overlooked. People may want to produce goods and services simply as a matter of wanting to share their products, and little more. Consider the broad open markets online, all the little industries people have therein, for instance. Granting a lot of that is done for money, still the motivations to be seen and heard are present, powerful, and wouldn't particularly go away if the money incentive is removed. What exactly is produced may alter, but people do labor for fun anyway. Motivation to build capacity for relative bioregional self-sufficiency. We might expect that many of the initial goods and services sought after by a given bioregion are likely exactly those that enable them to become more self-sufficient as such. Rather than, after all, supplying some place with clothing, food, shelter, or energy, supplying them with the relevant materials, skills, and so forth to create their own cottage industries meets the relevant needs overall. From labor's perspective, such is preferable as it means that they are not continuously being required to supply the needs, wants and desires of far distant bioregions. Such constitutes the motivation in general towards cottage industries after all. Note how that motive is absent within a moneyed system. In a moneyed system, the motive is to make other bioregions, other people more generally, dependent upon oneself in order to make money. It is an utterly inefficient and likely entirely crazy system after all. At the very least, such is the case in a reality of abundance. Why prefer this over the current system? I mean, folks would have to utilize their thinking skills to evaluate the differences overall. But in terms of the open gift-giving market in particular, such is wildly more efficient than the current systems, in that it rather directly and unproblematically meets the various demands of any given bioregion with the surpluses of supplies from other bioregions. Again, it is the relevant joint carving, prioritizing of productive aims towards the immediate bioregion and its adjacent bioregions, and the relevant prioritizing of interbioregional trade that provides for the sound and valid structure upon which such basic gift-giving ethics can be founded and utilized for their efficiency. It is the capacity to overproduce pretty much all goods and services at this point that enables such to occur without meaningful resentment. We are not dealing with a scarcity reality, but rather with a reality of overabundance. The relevant issues are about distribution, avoiding overproduction, and maintaining sound ecological systems at this point. The lazy fisher folk in large part deal with this issue. That is, absent the moneyed motivation, the incentive to overfish the seas largely goes away. Likewise, when each bioregion already has within it the capacity of self-sufficiency, the tendency to look elsewhere for their needs, wants and desires diminishes. Perhaps more directly and to the point, when the bioregional constraints are in place, the tendency to overfish in order to supply those fish to far-flung bioregions is removed. Again, such isn't to say that these kinds of interbioregional trade are barred, but rather that they are constrained to within the limits of the bioregion's relevant renewal rates. As well noted by plenty of other people at this point, the overfishing of the seas is a fundamentally huge issue that in the short term may require rather drastic measures to stop, such as limits on catches, enforcement of restrictions, etc. In the longer term, assuming we don't utterly destroy it beforehand, the Moneyless Free Labor Society largely and perhaps completely deals with that particular issue. The principle of restoring the fisheries in all honesty likely just takes a few years of people not really fishing it. That is, a few years long moratorium on most fishing would almost certainly restore the fisheries to a large degree at any rate. The primary issue involved therein in the current, of course, is the requirement to work to live, the requirements of the fisher folk to catch as many fish as they can in order to make as much money as they can. Such a moratorium on commercial fishing is not possible unless that motivation is removed. I'd suggest in the short term simply pay the fisher folk for not fishing for a few years. Same shit we do with all other farm products and have for decades if not centuries at this point. There isn't a shortage of other foods to use to feed people. No one starves, and for God's sake y'all, it's just a few years and it restores the fisheries. This is another example of the absolute madness involved in the current system. In terms of costs of money, we're talking like a fucking drop in the bucket worldwide to just pay the fisher folk not to fish commercially. I admit it is a bit more complicated than that, in that there are other industries that would suffer, but even paying all of these not to work is just a drop in the bucket in terms of money outlay, setting aside how utterly dumb the moneyed system is. Note how such wouldn't be a problem at all within a moneyless free labor system. No one gets paid, we just note that we're overfishing the seas, people take a few years off, fisheries are restored, and wham bam thank you ma'am. Not only is the problem solved but overall the fishing industry would vastly improve, the catches would be better, the fish would be higher quality, etc. Is such unrealistic? Would it take long to do? No, and no. Pandemic shatters that illusion. The species more or less shut down the whole world for many months, and it took little more than a month to do. Moratorium on commercial fishing could be accomplished in days, perhaps weeks at this point. Everyone involved has the relevant experience from the pandemic, hence the relevant skills, knowledge and systems are in place, and the people who are to be affected by it likewise know what it's like. No one starves, no one dies, it kinda sucks, it's kinda like a vacation for them too, so it's not even all that bad. The alternative is the destruction of the world's fisheries, so like a permanent moratorium on fishing for people, so like, figure it the fuck out people. Relevant to note the distinction between commercial fishing and non-commercial fishing. Non-commercial fishing is in essence fishing that one does not to sell to others, but to supply themselves with food, or in some cases wherein fishing is done communally to feed a local population, that is, eating the fish they locally catch is exactly their food source, rather than the usage of money. Such includes the relatively minorly impactful sports fishing, though perhaps not all of it, with regulations attached, etc., much of which are likely already in place, such as don't sport fish endangered species, limits on catches, etc. Such can be construed poorly in some places, as in, some places may read that and try to worm or weasel themselves into the exceptions. In general, if there is a valid alternative available to fishing during the moratorium, use it. That is, if the relevant local government can provide you with monies or food or whatever is sufficient to live on, do that instead. If there are no such possibilities for people, then do the fishing. I suspect that such exceptions are actually very rare and will have a negligible impact upon the overall fisheries. Shit isn't that difficult, y'all. Supposing that people remove their heads far enough from their asses to restore the fisheries, once such occurs, maintaining them is rather simple. Maintain the commercial fishing to within the relevant renewal rates. The sheer abundance of the fisheries post-moratorium are more than sufficient to meet the needs, wants and desires of people in general. As to who does the fishing, who has what rights to it, etc., I suspect that by and large the hands of labor are sufficient for handling that task. Absent any particular motive to mass fish for profit, the incentives to overfish are essentially removed. Local bioregions may fish commercially, that is, but the incentives to do so for money being removed. There simply isn't the relevant incentives to overfish at all. Insofar as there are desires to do en masse commercial fishing, providing that it is done so within the relevant renewal rates, there isn't any real issue involved with it. Noting again that post-moratorium the fisheries themselves would be highly improved, and that the incentives to let the fisheries reproduce themselves rather than overfishing them are far greater, from the hands of labor perspective, compared to, for instance, farming fish. Indeed, from fisherpeople's perspective, such is far preferable as it improves the quality of the catches, requires less labor for them to catch, etc., and from the consumer's perspective the increase in quality overall is a good. May such entail an overall reduction in the consumption of various fruits of the sea? Perhaps, but given the potential abundances there, in the short and mid-term such would actually entail a massive increase in possible consumption. In the long term we would expect that increase to level out some. In other words, in what also ought not be a surprise to anyone, if you overfish you reduce the overall supply. If you fish the right amount, you'll maximize the supply. The lazy fisher people is a good example of how to restore many of the systems that need it, the rationale for why, beyond avoiding utter catastrophe, being that it actually provides more abundance than to not. There is little reason to suspect that such isn't applicable broadly on these issues. This point is revisited in other examples later in this piece. Critically note that doing so within a moneyless free labor society is far simpler, namely, there isn't the complexities involved with trying to pay people the symbologies associated with trade, nor the realities whereby folks are literally working to live. Moreover, within a moneyless free labor society, this kind of thing happens regularly but not on catastrophic scalars. The ability to reduce the usage of resources, as a matter of course with a dual aim of staying within the guardrails of the renewal rates of resources, and to maximize productive use of those resources by enabling the natural processes to do their thing, that is, the imperatives of the hands of labor, rather than the desperation imperative to stop or die that the species currently faces, which is a humdrum expected kind of result from the current system that seeks to exploit as much as possible. As I said, such is pretty close to maximally crazed. The lazy fisher people is something of a proper and good analog to the current crazed mentality that causes the desperate imperative to stop or die, namely, the capitalistic grow or die imperative. Hence, folks ought also consider this section as also belonging within the real benefits of a moneyless free labor society section, having a non-crazed imperative embedded in the system being a plus. Due to the point's rather important and strong relevance to interbioregional trade, the author is placing it here. Who gets the fishes? In a restored fisheries, post-moratorium, the notion of supplying fishes to far distant bioregions isn't particularly far-fetched. That said, we ought expect and accept that the fisheries are not capable of supplying every bioregion on Earth, with every single variety of fishes and seafoods around. To be as clear as I can on that point, a restored fisheries would in point of fact increase the abundance level of seafoods, perhaps rather dramatically. Hence, we are speaking of an improvement in the availability of seafoods overall. However, even at that improved level of abundance, there would still remain the incapability of supplying all bioregions on Earth with all varieties of seafoods, and certainly not at equal or perhaps even equitable levels of distribution. Succinctly put, even a maximally distributed system wouldn't be equally distributed. The imperatives and structure of the Moneyless Free Labor Societies already entails the basics of how such a system would be distributed, that is, bioregionally constrained rather than wealth, money, constrained. Places wherein the seafood is harvested would tend to be the places with the most seafoods of that kind available, as would adjacent bioregions. Likewise, places that are closer to the sea would tend to be better supplied, as there is an imperative for shorter supply lines. Places far inland would have lesser supplies, though again, such may actually be a greater supply than they currently have. Among the more interesting aspects of the fisheries is that in many cases, perhaps in most cases, the bounty of the sea is not bound by political borders, and with a few exceptions the bounty is available only in far distant places relative to civilization. Hence, there is a real sense in which the shorter supply lines principle is odd though not off, and there is a sense whereby the bioregional constraints may be somewhat far off. Note that in some cases the bioregional constraints are exactly right. There are places whereby a restored fisheries would entail that certain bioregions are the obvious locales of concern for the seafoods. For instance, the waters around the Philippines primarily supplying the Philippines, the waters of the South China Sea primarily supply southern China, the waters of the Salish Seas providing primarily for the peoples of the Salish Seas, and so on. But there are examples whereby no significant mass of peoples live by the fisheries in question, and an en masse harvest of the seafoods therein, provided it is within the renewal rates, simply couldn't even realistically be providing for the local populace. For example, the Gulf of Alaska, many of the far northern or far southern seas, and virtually any deep-sea fishing. The question therein is, lacking any obvious bioregional restraints, how would a moneyless free labor society distribute the goods therein? Partly, again, the imperative for shorter supply lines answers this question, with the hands of labor playing a meaningful role therein. In other words, firstly, the distribution to coastal areas already delimits and rather significantly answers the question of concern. In other words, the imperative for shorter supply lines entails that coastal areas are those that are supplied primarily. Likewise, relative proximity to the harvest location also entails a good deal of restriction. See also the inclusive waters to a bioregion, as partly this question is stemming from a misunderstanding regarding bioregions, as bioregions do include the ocean and sea waters. Though again, I think there is something to this question, as there are a lot of available seafoods off the coast of Alaska, and very few folks within the region to partake in them, similar for most far northern and far southern seas, and all deep seas. The hands of labor themselves do a fair amount of the delimitation of the supplies. The lazy fisherfolk, recall, have no monetary incentives to overfish. Their incentives to, for instance, travel weeks at sea to get to some far-flung location in order to catch huge bounties, travel many weeks more, just to what exactly? If they're hungry, sure, such very well may be the case, but here we are speaking of a restored fisheries, whereby in most cases folks could simply travel for a few hours or days to get to good fishing. As a laborer, which would you generally prefer to do? The supposition here is that currently there are moneyed interests that seek to catch as much as they can, not to feed starving people, or anything of the sort like needs in a strict sense, but rather pure desires in a rather extravagant sense, and in the sense of making money, neither of these being motivations being present in a moneyless free labor society. This process having overfished the fisheries in the first place. Conversely, folks may ask if we are therefore going to be underutilizing a given resource. That is, absent any moneyed interests, is it the case that no one would bother to fish the far-flung seas, north or south, nor for that matter, the deep seas? To which my sense in all honesty is no. I suspect folks would exactly do so, but for other motives, and motives that are far and away less destructive. Prestige, something fun to do, the adventure of it, the relative exoticity of it, the capacity to in fact bring seafoods to home that are novel, new, interesting, etc. Again, there are plenty of motives whereby people do these sorts of things, and there always has been. In the current, whereby there are already limits placed on catches to try and avoid total destruction of the fisheries, we ought note that there is in fact a system in place whereby allotments and control of the distribution of those allotments takes place. In other words, there are answers to the questions already at hand, by which those motivated to ask such questions have generally already accepted as valid. The Moneyless Free Labor Society doesn't necessarily hold that there is something different in that regard, rather, it is holding bluntly that a moratorium ought to be done, that such is very plausible to do, that such restores and renews the fisheries, overall increases the abundance available, and provides for a systemization of motivations and distributions whereby that abundance can be maintained, rather than the current whereby it is recklessly depleted. Again, what is good for the fisheries is good for the other aspects of the bioregions, noting again that such moratoriums are painless in a moneyless free labor society, and are broadly not oft needed because a moneyless free labor society better handles the resources in general, by maintaining them within their renewal rates, doing so largely through non-coercive means for that matter, specifically, the hands of labor, open gift-giving markets, imperatives for shorter supply lines, and imperatives to supply locally primarily, but not exclusively, predicated upon the relevant joint carving of bioregional structures. Regarding fossil fuels, even from the most conservative standpoint, these are essentially non-renewable resources, that is, very slow renewables, and we are wildly using them faster than they renew. Folks still in the climate change denial delusion likely can't very well be reasonable or reasoned with on this point. Labor, that is, labor with a capital L, understands this issue as one of just transition. Such can realistically take place rather quickly within the moneyless free labor system, as they needn't necessarily continue working in order to live. Much as with the lazy fisher peoples, the fossil fuel folks could simply stop doing the labor, insofar as such is possible without destroying the world, causing mass starvation, etc., there is, after all, something of value they are currently producing. The point, though, is that there wouldn't be the kind of pushback from the industry as they are fighting to live, not as an industry, but as a matter of monies, jobs, and so forth. Absent that kind of requirement, folks laboring in that industry could simply not work as needed, and transition to some other job without the horrors associated with it, such as loss of ability to feed, clothe, and shelter their families, or even radical shifts in their lifestyles. Relevantly noting on the first pass-through of the system, technically nothing has to change. We can just remove the money and keep doing all the labor. Noting, though, that ultimately this kind of system depends upon bioregionally constrained usage of resources, etc., all of which of course takes time to implement. See Section 14, Pragmatics of Implementation. That said, other sources of energy are almost certainly needed overall, and until they're in place, the usage of fossil fuels is something of a necessity. Much space in this piece has already been given to the point of long-term usage of slow renewables if, that is, folks want to bother continuing this species, which they of course don't have to. The systemization described is rather explicitly applicable to the issue of fossil fuels. In terms of climate change, however, I want to suggest that the implementation of the Moneyless Free Labor Society is exactly the relevant methodology to address that particular issue. That is to say, the system itself is something of a guide and suggestive step-by-step methodology of implementation for addressing that issue. Understanding that more than just dealing with climate change, the notions also deal with the issues of mass extinctions, pollution, loss of wild spaces, restoration of bioregions, overworking, overproducing, etc., for the most part not in detail, but rather in broad technique and theory of economies that are of course actually predicated upon labor and ecologies, not money. Hence, the notion of the hands of labor within bioregionally constrained production provides the kinds of checks and balances required to deal with the relevant issues just alluded to. Folks fired up to find and implement a solution have one at hand. They merely need accept that fact, not make pretense of pretentious argument about it, and do the hard work of actualizing it.
Anong oras na?